Have you ever thought about how one moment can change everything? 1 second, you're on top of the world, and the next, you're fighting to survive. Life has a way of reminding us just how fragile it can be, how wealth, power, or success mean little in the face of an unexpected twist of fate. Today, we're diving into the extraordinary story of Richard Allen, a self-made millionaire who seemed to have everything a person could dream of: success, fame, and fortune. But his world came to a screeching halt after a tragic car accident left him in a coma. What followed wasn't just a fight for life. It was a journey of rediscovery, transformation, and redemption. Richard's story is not just about one man. It's about all of us. It's about how we confront the unexpected, face our inner demons, and reimagine our lives when forced to start over. Whether you've experienced a major setback or wondered what truly matters, his story is a powerful reminder that the greatest wealth lies not in possessions but in purpose. So, how does a man with everything to lose and no second chances find his way back? Let's begin this journey together. Richard Allen was the kind of man who appeared untouchable. In his early 40s, he had built a tech empire from scratch, turning an ambitious startup into a billion-dollar enterprise. His name regularly appeared on the covers of business magazines, and his social media posts showcased the kind of life most people only dream of: private jets, luxury cars, sprawling mansions, and vacations in the world's most exclusive locations. But beneath the glittering exterior, Richard's life was far from perfect. He was estranged from his family, including his younger brother, Mark, who had once been his closest confidant. Their relationship fractured years ago when Richard prioritized his career over family obligations. He hadn't attended Mark's wedding or met his young niece, always justifying it with the excuse of being too busy. Richard's personal relationships were just as hollow. While he surrounded himself with people at parties and events, few, if any, truly knew him. Most saw him as a boss, a business mogul, or an opportunity, but never as a man struggling to fill an emotional void. In truth, Richard had poured everything into his work, believing that success could mask the loneliness that followed him like a shadow. The night of the accident started like many others. Richard had spent the evening at a corporate gala where he'd received yet another award for his achievements. He left the event late, tired but energized by the adrenaline of his latest success. Driving his sleek sports car through the rain-slick streets of the city, he pushed the car's speed to the limit, craving the thrill. But then it happened. As he rounded a sharp curve on a deserted road, the tires lost traction. The car spun out of control, crashing into a guardrail before flipping over into a ditch. The silence after the crash was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of rain and the faint hum of his car's engine. Richard was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, where doctors worked frantically to save his life. The prognosis was grim: severe head trauma, multiple fractures, and swelling in his brain. He slipped into a coma within hours. As Richard lay unconscious, his absence began to ripple through his carefully constructed world. His employees panicked as the stock price of his company dropped overnight. Investors demanded answers. Meanwhile, Mark, who hadn't spoken to his brother in years, was notified as his next of kin. For the first time in a long time, Mark found himself stepping into Richard's world, a world he had long resented. The stage was set for a battle not only for Richard's life, but for the legacy he would leave behind. Richard's journey began not with action, but with stillness. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months as he remained in a coma. For his family, the waiting was agonizing. His brother Mark, despite years of bitterness and resentment, found himself sitting by Richard's bedside almost daily, grappling with emotions he hadn't confronted in years. Mark stared at the monitors beeping steadily, wondering why he felt so conflicted. On one hand, Richard had always been selfish, consumed by his career and ambition, leaving no room for family. On the other, Mark couldn't deny the pang of guilt that came with seeing his brother so vulnerable. This was the same brother who had once taught him how to ride a bike, who stayed up all night helping him study for exams. Where had that man gone? Richard's medical team was blunt. The chances of him waking up were slim. If he did, he might never be the same. But as his body lay still, Richard's mind wasn't idle. Deep within the recesses of his subconscious, memories surfaced. He saw himself as a young boy playing soccer with Mark in their backyard, their mother cheering them on. He remembered the pride on her face when he graduated from college, and the promise he had made to her to always look after Mark. In these dreamlike states, Richard felt an overwhelming sense of regret. The laughter, the warmth, the simplicity of those moments. It was all so far removed from the life he had built. Somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of what truly mattered. Meanwhile, Mark faced his own challenges outside the hospital. Richard's business was in chaos, with investors threatening to pull out and executives scrambling to manage without their leader. Despite his lack of experience in the corporate world, Mark stepped in to help stabilize things. It wasn't easy. The same people who once worshipped Richard were now circling like vultures, waiting for the right moment to seize control. As Mark navigated these challenges, he began to see the cracks in Richard's seemingly perfect life. The pressure, the loneliness, and the relentless pursuit of more had taken a toll. It wasn't just the accident that had broken Richard. It was everything leading up to it. Then, one quiet afternoon, something extraordinary happened. Mark was reading a book aloud, a habit he had developed during his visits, when he noticed Richard's fingers twitch. At first, he thought he was imagining it. But then it happened again, a small, deliberate movement. He called for the nurse, and within minutes, the room was a flurry of activity. Over the next few days, Richard began to show more signs of awareness. His eyelids fluttered, his hands squeezed Mark's during physical therapy sessions, and eventually, he opened his eyes. The recovery was far from immediate. Richard was weak, disoriented, and unable to speak at first. But the fact that he had woken up at all was nothing short of a miracle. As he regained consciousness, Richard's first thoughts weren't of his business or his possessions. They were of Mark, sitting faithfully by his side, and the fragments of memories that had played like a movie in his mind. He tried to speak but couldn't, tears streaming down his face instead. Mark squeezed his hand, understanding more than words could convey. Richard's physical recovery would take months, but the emotional and mental journey he was about to embark on would be even more profound. He was no longer the man he had been before the accident. His near-death experience had awakened something deep within him, a desire to rebuild, but this time, to build something meaningful. As he lay in his hospital bed, Richard began to reflect on his life. What had all the money and success truly brought him? He thought about the people he had hurt, the relationships he had neglected, and the emptiness he had tried to fill with material things. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his choices, and a glimmer of hope that it wasn't too late to make things right. The turning point in Richard's journey came one fateful evening, 3 months into his recovery. By this time, he had regained his ability to speak and move, though his strength was still limited. The hospital had become his temporary home, and the routine of physical therapy, medical tests, and endless introspection was both exhausting and enlightening. That evening, Richard was sitting in his hospital room, staring out the window as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city. Mark walked in, holding an old photo album he had dug up from their childhood home. "I thought this might jog some memories," Mark said, sitting down beside him. Richard hesitated as Mark opened the album. The first photo was of the two of them as children, sitting on the front steps of their modest house, grinning from ear to ear. Richard couldn't help but smile. "I haven't seen these in years," Richard said, his voice softer than usual. As they flipped through the pages, the photos told a story Richard had long buried. Birthday parties in their backyard, family dinners at the tiny kitchen table, road trips in their old station wagon. Every image brought back a flood of emotions. Then they came to a picture of their mother, holding the two of them close, her eyes filled with pride. It was taken just a few months before she passed away. Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. "She always believed in you, you know," Mark said quietly. "She used to say you were going to change the world. And you did, Richard. But at what cost?" The question hung in the air, heavy with truth. Richard's mind raced. He had spent years chasing success, believing that it would make his mother proud. But in doing so, he had lost sight of the values she had instilled in him: kindness, humility, and the importance of family. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. The conversation with Mark had unearthed a deep well of regret, But it also sparked something else: determination. He realized that his second chance at life wasn't just a gift, it was a responsibility. If he was going to rebuild, he needed to start from the inside out. The next morning, Richard asked Mark to bring him a notebook and a pen. "I need to make a list," he explained. "A list of everything I need to fix." The first name he wrote down was Mark's. Over the following weeks, Richard began reaching out to the people he had hurt or neglected over the years. He started with Mark, apologizing for the years of distance and for putting his career above their relationship. Mark was hesitant at first, unsure if Richard's change was genuine, but as they spent more time together, he began to see a side of his brother he hadn't seen in decades, a side that cared deeply, that listened, that wanted to make amends. Richard also reached out to his employees, many of whom had felt undervalued under his leadership. He held meetings with his executive team, not to issue orders but to listen. For the first time, he acknowledged the toll his relentless drive had taken on those around him. He promised to build a company culture that prioritized people over profits, a promise that was met with both skepticism and cautious optimism. But the most profound change came from within. Richard began working with a therapist, delving into the fears and insecurities that had driven his obsession with success. He realized that much of his ambition stemmed from a need to prove his worth, to himself, to his late mother, and to the world. Letting go of that need was one of the hardest things he had ever done. One evening, during a therapy session, Richard had a breakthrough. His therapist asked him to visualize what a fulfilling life would look like if money and success weren't factors. The image that came to mind surprised him. It wasn't a luxurious mansion or a high-profile award ceremony. It was a simple family dinner, with Mark and his niece laughing around the table and Richard feeling at peace. That vision became his new goal. Richard began making changes that reflected his newfound priorities. He sold his sprawling mansion and downsized to a modest home closer to Mark's family. He set up a foundation focused on mental health and work-life balance, using his resources to help others avoid the pitfalls he had faced. And he restructured his company, delegating more responsibilities to his team so he could focus on what truly mattered. The journey wasn't without its challenges. Some of Richard's investors pushed back, accusing him of losing his edge. Others questioned his motivations, seeing his changes as little more than a PR stunt. But Richard stood firm, knowing that his transformation wasn't for them. It was for himself, for his family, and for the legacy he wanted to leave behind. One night, as Richard sat in his new home, surrounded by Mark, his niece, and a handful of close friends, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: contentment. The man who had once defined himself by his net worth had discovered a far greater wealth in the love and connection he had rebuilt. Richard's transformation didn't happen overnight, and the road to fully overcoming his challenges was paved with obstacles. The changes he was implementing, both in his personal life and his business, tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated. For one, stepping back from his role as the driving force behind his company felt almost unnatural. Delegating authority to others required trust, something Richard had always struggled with. He spent weeks mentoring his executives, ensuring they understood the company's vision and values. At first, they resisted, unsure if Richard's intentions were genuine or a temporary response to his accident. But slowly, his sincerity broke through their skepticism. At the same time, Richard faced external challenges from the corporate world. The media latched onto his story, dubbing him the humbled millionaire, which brought both praise and criticism. Some celebrated his new philanthropic efforts, while others accused him of trying to repair a tarnished image. Richard ignored the noise, focusing instead on his actions. But perhaps the hardest obstacle to overcome was the internal struggle. The habits and mindset that had driven Richard for decades didn't simply disappear. There were days when he felt the pull of his old life, the temptation to throw himself back into work, to measure his worth by numbers on a balance sheet. On those days, he relied on the people he had begun to surround himself with, including his therapist and, more importantly, his family. Mark played a pivotal role in Richard's journey. Once skeptical of his brother's transformation, Mark became his biggest supporter. The two began spending more time together, often reminiscing about their childhood and discussing the values their mother had instilled in them. Richard also took an active role in Mark's family life, attending his niece's school events and helping her with homework. These moments became a source of joy and healing for Richard, reminding him of what he had missed in his pursuit of success. One particularly poignant moment came when Richard attended Mark's daughter's piano recital. As he sat in the audience, watching her play with confidence and passion, Richard was overwhelmed with pride. He realized that these were the moments he had always been chasing, the moments that made life truly meaningful. In his business, Richard began implementing new strategies to create a healthier work environment. He introduced mental health resources for employees, reduced mandatory overtime, and encouraged a culture of collaboration rather than competition. The changes weren't always easy. Some employees resisted, and productivity initially dipped as the company adjusted. But over time, the positive impact became undeniable. Employee satisfaction rose, and the company's culture began to shift in a way that aligned with Richard's new vision. As he made these changes, Richard faced one final test. An investor, frustrated by the company's new direction, threatened to pull out and take several others with him. It was a moment that could have derailed everything Richard had worked toward. The old Richard might have caved to their demands, reverting to his relentless pursuit of growth at all costs. Instead, Richard stood firm. He met with the investors and explained his vision, not as a businessman but as a man who had seen the cost of unchecked ambition. He spoke about the importance of balance, purpose, and sustainability, not just for the company, but for everyone involved. His authenticity struck a chord. While a few investors left, most stayed, inspired by Richard's courage and conviction. This victory marked a turning point for Richard. It reinforced his belief that staying true to his values was not only the right choice, but also the key to long-term success. As time passed, the ripple effects of Richard's transformation became evident. His company flourished under its new direction, becoming a model for balancing profitability with employee well-being. The foundation he had started began making a tangible difference in communities, funding programs that supported mental health and work-life balance. Most importantly, Richard himself had changed. He no longer measured his success by the size of his bank account or the accolades on his shelf. Instead, he found fulfillment in the connections he had rebuilt and the lives he was impacting. Months later, as Richard stood before a crowd of employees, partners, and friends at his company's annual meeting, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. This wasn't the man who had once used these gatherings to boast about record profits or bold expansion plans. This was a man who had learned that true success wasn't about numbers, it was about people. He looked out at the audience, a mix of familiar and new faces, and began to speak. 6 months ago, he started. His voice steady but emotional. I was given a second chance. A second chance to live, to reflect, and to rebuild. And I want to thank all of you for being part of that journey. The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Richard wasn't delivering a polished speech. He was sharing his heart. I used to think success was about how much I could achieve, how far I could go, and how much I could accumulate. But lying in that hospital bed, unable to move, unable to speak, I realized something profound. None of that mattered if I didn't have people to share it with. He paused, glancing over at Mark, who sat in the front row with his daughter. Mark gave him a small nod, his expression one of pride and encouragement. Today, I'm proud of what this company has become, not because of our profits, but because of our people. We've created something that values balance, purpose, and connection, and that's a legacy worth building. The audience erupted in applause, and Richard felt a wave of emotion wash over him. It was a moment of closure, a testament to how far he had come. After the meeting, Richard joined Mark and his niece for dinner at a small family-owned restaurant. It was a far cry from the high-end establishments he used to frequent, but it felt right. As they laughed and shared stories, Richard realized that this was his true wealth. Moments like these, filled with love and authenticity. In the months that followed, Richard continued to embrace his new life. He became a mentor to young entrepreneurs, sharing his story and encouraging them to define success on their own terms. He worked closely with his foundation, focusing on initiatives that promoted mental health and supported individuals facing the same struggles he once had. But perhaps the greatest transformation was in his relationship with himself. For the first time in decades, Richard felt at peace. He no longer carried the burden of proving his worth or chasing an endless horizon. Instead, he focused on living fully in the present, cherishing the simple joys he had once overlooked. One afternoon, while walking through a park with Mark and his niece, Richard stopped to watch a group of children playing soccer. He was reminded of his own childhood, of the countless games he and Mark had played in their backyard. "You ever think about those days?" Richard asked, smiling at his brother. "All the time," Mark replied. "You know, Mom would have been proud of you, of the man you've become." Richard felt a lump rise in his throat, but managed to nod. "I hope so. She was the one who taught us what really matters." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, Richard felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. His life had come full circle, not in the way he had planned, but in a way that felt infinitely more meaningful. The accident that had once seemed like a curse had become the catalyst for his greatest transformation. It had forced him to confront his flaws, to rebuild broken relationships, and to redefine what success meant. And in doing so, it had given him a gift far greater than wealth or accolades, the chance to truly live. Richard's story was no longer about a man who had everything and lost it. It was about a man who lost his way and found something far more valuable. Richard's journey serves as a reminder that life's greatest challenges often hold the seeds of our greatest growth. Whether it's a near-death experience, a career setback, or a moment of doubt, these challenges force us to reflect on what truly matters. For Richard, the lesson was clear. Success is not measured by what we achieve, but by the lives we touch, the relationships we nurture, and the peace we find within ourselves. To anyone reading or listening, the question remains: what are you chasing, and is it worth the cost? Sometimes, the path to happiness isn't about achieving more. It's about letting go, finding balance, and embracing the life that's right in front of you. As Richard walked away from the park that evening, hand in hand with his niece, he felt a sense of closure. His story wasn't perfect, but it was real. And in its imperfections, he had found beauty. Life isn't about the destination. It's about the journey. It's about the lessons we learn, the connections we make, and the legacy we leave behind. So, as you go about your day, take a moment to reflect. Are you living a life of meaning and purpose, or are you caught in the endless pursuit of more? The answers may surprise you. And like Richard, you might find that the greatest wealth lies not in what you have, but in who you are and the love you give.